Okay. You ready? Okay. Last week we were talking about the Tefillah b'shas hadlakas neiros, right? So we were discussing the inyan of bakashas and tchinas on Shabbos, and I mentioned that by the song of Ribon, there's a similar shmuz about the permissibility of certain passages in Ribon. In particular, the last two, where we say Perek Yasanach and the one about building the Beis Hamikdash. So now, I bet we're not holding there. We're up to Hadlakas Neiros, but I'm going to digress and just talk about Ribon. I'm just going to digress and talk about Ribon because we're passing it by it anyhow. So now, Ribon was composed by Rabbi Yisrael Najara. Rabbi Yisrael ben Reb Moshe Najara. His father, Reb Moshe, was born in Tzfas. One of the, he escaped from Spain. He was born. His parents escaped from Spain. He was born in Tzfas. He was one of the Gurei Ari. He was close to the Arizal. And I think Rabbi Yisrael Najara himself was about low 20s when the Arizal was nifter. So he himself was exposed to the Arizal. He lived in Tzfas during that period. Eventually, the last 5 years of his life, I think he lived till about 60-something, the last 5 years of his life, Rabbi Yisrael Najara became the Rav in Gaza City. So actually now, a few months ago, they found the shul of the Najara family. His son, Reb Moshe Najara, he was a Sephardi, so he named his son after his father. His son, Reb Moshe Najara, was a Rav in Tzfas for decades, in Gaza for decades. So the Najara family was the Rabbanim of Gaza. They found the shul that belonged to the Najara family. So, but Rabbi Yisrael Najara was primarily lived in Tzfas. The last 5 years of his life, he lived in Gaza. Now, he was a Bal Halacha. He wrote several svarim, some of them halacha svarim. One of them is called Sheikh Ha'iladim, I think that's what it's called, which means it was about children and shchita, like young people being sheikhtim. He wrote some other sefer halacha, but primarily he became famous for his songs. He wrote a 2-volume sefer called Zmiris Yisrael. We only sing a tiny portion of his songs. Became famous, for everyday usage, but he became famous be'ikr for his songs, for the Zmiris Yisrael. Now, his most famous song that Gans Klal Yisrael adapted is Ribon. Now, Ribon, he signs his name acrostically, right? It's Yisrael. The first letter of each one of the Pizmonim adds up to Yisrael. He signed his name. That's his most famous song that he became famous for. Now, there were many, many Gedolim who prized that song as the main centerpiece of their Shabbos, Tish, Suda, etc. They felt that song was extremely lofty and elevated. But L'mashal, the Chasam Sofer, it's brought down in Anhagas Chasam Sofer. Chasam Sofer didn't sing Ribon. When they confronted him and said, "How come we don't sing Ribon?" He, instead of making an issue out of it and discussing it, he said, "Okay, I'm singing Ribon." And whenever someone wanted to, he would sing Ribon. So he didn't want to make a fuss about it, but it wasn't on the Chasam Sofer's main list of Zmiris. So I just want to go a little bit back into the backstory of what made Ribon controversial, what made Yisrael Najara controversial, Ribon controversial, and before it became so popular, what was the story with Ribon. And then there's also several halacha shaylos, and that's really the continuation from last week. So now, just for starters, the inyan of Zmiris on Shabbos. So really, there's a mashmois in the Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah, when it talks about Sudas HaChashverosh, the Gemara says, "Vayem Hashvi ketayv lev hamelach v'yayin." The Gemara darshan Zamar Rava, "Yem Hashvi Shabbos haya sheYisrael oichlim v'shaysin maschilim b'divrei Torah u'b'divrei tishbachis." The Klal Yisrael, the way Sudas Shabbos looks, is they start with divrei Torah and they end up with Zmiris v'tishbachis. In the Sefer Hasidim, it's brought down that a drush of the pasuk Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbos Tov L'Hedis L'Hashem L'Zamar L'Shem Chalayin. The Sefer Hasidim says V'yesh L'Smeich B'Shabbos B'Kud Hashem Yishar M'Sam Chilev. He encourages singing, based on that pasuk. So singing Shabbos Miris is something that's really based on the Gemara and Megillah and the Sefer Hasidim. So it's an old, well accepted custom in Klal Yisrael. Now, which Zmiris to sing? So that's not so simple. So Rabbi Yisrael Najara in his Zmiris Yisrael composed a bunch of different Negonim, but this song Ribon itself, Be'etzem, seems like a very, upstanding song. There's nothing wrong with it. So there's a few different facets I want to discuss over here of why it took some time for Rabbi Yisrael Najara's songs to become successful. The first one, and this is the most controversial one, is the personal one. There's a sefer that was published called Sefer Chazyonis. It's a Ksav Yad of Rav Chaim Vital. It's really a mix of two different svarim that got published together in one from Rav Chaim Vital. And in it, it's a very interesting collection of Rav Chaim Vital's great drive and desire to figure out what his own Sherish HaNeshama is. And it's based on all different chalemus that he had, and he quotes in there different chalemus that different ruchas had. He quotes chalemus that a woman who was possessed had. It's a very, very interesting, very unique sefer. I don't think there's any svarim that are similar to it. It's a very unique sefer, and it's full of like borderline controversial things that are a little bit things that are a little too personal. And when the sefer was published in 1953, after it took a long hiatus, the sefer was available, back in the day. The Chida writes that he saw the sefer. The Chida saw a Ksav Yad of Chaim Vital of the sefer. The sefer took a long hiatus from being available in print. And in 1953, someone by the name of Eshkoli published a sefer with Mossad Rav Kook, and he published it in all its glory. He didn't leave out anything. Nothing was covered up. And Reb Reuven Margolius of Margolius Hayam fame and many other svarim, who was a great bibliophile and knew svarim very well, came out with a big milchama campaign that the Sefer Chazionis is fake. It's a forgery. The turn of phrase and the usage of certain words is not how Chaim Vital spoke. It's not how people in the day spoke. And he campaigned very, very strongly to have the thing pulled off the shelf. Ad kedei kach that Mossad Rav Kook never republished the Eshkoli edition of Sefer Chazionis. Now, Lemaisa, later on, other mechons republished it, much later on in its complete form. Other mechons published it in a censored form where they took out certain controversial bits of it. Some say in about the year 2000, the Ksav Yad that the Chida refers to in Shem HaGedolim was discovered, and it's undoubtedly a Ksav Yad of Chaim Vital. So this is one of the authentic Svarim, but still, many held that the Chaim Vital never intended it for print. Meaning, if Chaim Vital intended it, he was jotting down things. He never intended this to be publicly printed, and maybe he himself would have edited it. And Kayidu, a lot of Chaim Vital's writings, he himself was never ready to share, and they were leaked, they were stolen. A lot of the Kisvei Rav Chaim Vital's Ksavim, the Arizal's Torah, was stolen while Rav Chaim Vital was on his deathbed. So a lot of things never went through the final editing stage, and you could disregard certain things that are in it, in Kavanah. Now, one of the things, the most controversial bits in the Sefer Chazionis is that he goes after Yisrael Najara in an extremely personal way. The Rav Chaim Vital in Sefer Chazionis writes, all sorts of different, allegations and stories that were said about Yisrael Najara, and therefore he says that nobody should dare sing his songs, is what Rav Chaim Vital writes. Chaim Vital in Sefer Chazionis writes that based on his personal knowledge of who Yisrael Najara was, nobody should dare sing Yisrael Najara songs. Now, some of the allegations or rumors that Rav Chaim Vital quotes over there, in different eschayos are missing and are controversial, and I'm not going to share them. The Chida seemed to disregard them. The Chida and Shem HaGedolim, who was very well aware of the Sefer Chazionis, brings in his Erech on Yisrael Najara that he was a gadol and a tzaddik, and he disregards the harshest critiques of Rav Chaim Vital. So I'm gonna leave those aside. But there is one critique that he brings that's not super harsh that we could discuss, and that's as follows. He writes that Yisrael Najara was sitting. He was sitting as follows. He says, Kava Sudase b'shah plainis, b'beis Yaakov mundish, v'hiniach koivei b'karka. He put his hat on the ground. V'zimer shiris b'kol ram. He sang songs very loud. V'achol basar v'shasa yayin. He ate, he drank, and he sang very, very loud. Fine. V'ani chayim, he says, this is Chaim Vital writing, V'ani chayim siparti lo yizeh ha'inyan, v'hoideli shekein haya. I told him that it came to my attention that he had been sitting, with his hat on the floor, singing out loud, and then eating and drinking, and I mentioned to him that he did this, and v'hoideli, v'hoideli shekein haya, and he was moided to me that this happened. Now he continues on with other allegations and whatever, but that's not for today. So now, this taina that Rav Chaim Vital writes, and because of it he says not to sing his songs, is that Kilu, like Yisrael Najara, didn't take it, the proper Kovid Roy, she didn't take it serious enough, sitting with his hat on the floor, and he was singing, and this is Rav Chaim Vital writes. So now this is an interesting second piece to the story that I think maybe shows why Klal Yisrael adopted his songs and disregarded this avla that Rav Chaim Vital is bringing to light. Now this is brought down with the Sefer Chamdas Yamim, which is itself a sefer that has quite a backstory. But in Sefer Chamdas Yamim, good evening, he brings that as follows. He says, I'll quote you, I'll read the lashon from the Chamdas Yamim. He says, Ma'aseh shahaya b'mei Arizal, shahaya b'zmanei Rav Yisrael Najara Zal, v'haya ne'im zmiris Yisrael. There was a story that happened in the days of the Arizal, and Rav Yisrael Najara, who was there, was the ne'im zmiris Yisrael. He was the singer for Klal Yisrael. The Yesh Omer, he says, shehigid alav Arizal, shahaya nitzutz David HaMelech alav hashalom. There are even some who say that the Arizal said about Rav Yisrael Najara that he's a nitzutz of David HaMelech. Upam achas belel Shabbos Kodesh, haya hachacham anisker. Shair al Shulchani. This Chacham, Rabbi Yisrael Najara, was sitting by his table and he was singing, Kimin Hagei Atoiv, like his minig always was. Now, V'roa Arizal, and we don't know if the Arizal was standing there, watching the Rishon Najara Suda, or the Arizal was home and he saw this. However, he saw things. Says V'roa Arizal, Malachim la'alafim v'revavis oilim v'yardim b'beisei l'shmaya l'arina. The Arizal saw tens and thousands of malachim clamoring to the house of Rishon Najara to hear him sing his Shabbos Nagunim. Ki kol shir of Hay Baruch HaKodesh. All his songs are Baruch HaKodesh. V'teikaf miyad, histakel Rav Arizal, sheba malach echad. Suddenly the Arizal noticed that a malach came, v'silik l'chol machana ha-malachim ashurim sham. An enforcer malach came and sent all the other malachim away. He can't be over here now. Al dvar shahim mesher al ashochan al shalafnei Hashem, b'zroyis megulim v'gam al davar shleihei ha'kayv al reishay. Because he was singing with his arms exposed and he wasn't wearing a hat. When the Arizal realized this, now here it's clear that Arizal wasn't there. When the Arizal realized that this is what was wrong, and it could be one of them was Rav Chaim Vital. It's possible. That's possibly the other side of the story that we're seeing in Sefer Chazyanis. And actually, I think I'm seeing now in the Chamdas Yamim it says that the two Talmidim was Rav Chaim Vital and Maria Kohen. So it was Rav Chaim Vital we sent. And legally it says Azne Leimar Ki Malacha Elihim Mishtashim El Shira V'Rinoisav Bavor Shalehoy B'Kavod Al Shochan Estalkul L'Maylo. He said, please notify Rishon Najara that Malachim who were clamoring around to hear your songs had to leave because you weren't sitting with the right way. Shmaya HaChacham Aniskar Sadavar Achzasei Ra'ada who picked Birchaim V'Chalchela B'Chol Masnav. He started trembling and shaking his knees. V'Amad Marid V'Yashav B'Kavod Gadol, and he straightened himself up and he sat with tremendous derech eretz al shulchani v'chazul l'shirei shei mishabeach with the very sevalim v'anashim, and he returned back to his songs that he was being mishabeach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'teikuf miyad chazur malchei shemayim lavik b'rishayna sasim usmechim b'mishtashim shashu arav kimez tutei chasen v'kala v'arav ariv talmidei hagadol zal royim mafli lases. So this is the Chamdas Yamim brings, which is possibly the other side of the story of what the Sefer Chazyanis is bringing. He's bringing that there was such a story where the Arizal had a vision. And you saw, now keep in mind that the Rishon Najara was under 20 when this is happening. So this story, he's called Harav Hagadol, and you see the Arizal being made about him, that his Zmiris brought down, hordes of Malachim to come hear his songs. So you get the feeling that his Zmiris are next level, meaning his Zmiris are something that surpasses everybody else's Zmiris. And you see why people from that world, from Tzfas in that world, would have been so attached to his Zmiris. So even though in Sefer Chazyanis it's brought down as a very negative story about him, it's Yitachan that Rav Chaim Vital recorded that at the time of it happening, and Rishon Najara corrected it. He was a young man, he corrected it, and like the Chidah probably held, is that the Sefer Chazyanis was never meant to be published in a public way. It was never edited. Meaning Rav Chaim Vital, who knew him till many, many years, and in other places in his letters and his Svarim, refers to him as a Rav Hagadol, and he refers to him with a nice amount of derech eretz, wouldn't have held that should be the safe pasuk on his miras. Now these are just two parts of the same story that l'chayra dovetail with each other. Now that's l'chayra why his songs caught on, in such a shleimistic and conclusive way. Now let's get to some of the kilo halachic issues with his songs. So we spoke last week already that the Yerushalmi in Shabbos says, and I'll just chazer it over. The Yerushalmi in Shabbos that we mentioned last week, the Yerushalmi says, Tani asur l'tvaya tzrachim b'Shabbos. A person is not allowed to be tevei his tzrachim on Shabbos. Rav Zeira Shal Rav Chia Barba, Ma'o Mema Re'enu Parnaseinu. What about moneying and benching Re'enu Parnaseinu? Amalei Tufas Brachas Kachi. The Tufas HaBrach is that, so that's not a problem. So we had this idea, the Shaila last week, that anytime you're going to say Tchinas or Bakashis on Shabbos, it can be problematic. Now, Ribon, the first four are just Shvachim for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the last two stanzas of Ribon, which is what? The last one's Mikdash Tov, and the first one before that is Lekadilei. Yikar Ruvusa Preik Yasanach, which is asking for Klal Yisrael, to be redeemed from Galus, and Mikdash Tov is asking for the Beit HaMikdash to be built. So the Chayr, these are grace of Bakashis that are being asked. So that's question number one. Now question number two is another shayla that some Paiskim have ma'ir, is that the Gemara in Shabbos in the Bavli and Daf Yud Beis, in the famous Gemara, the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Chanina, B'koshi yetiru l'nacham avelim l'vakar chaylim b'Shabbos. B'koshi, when we let people do nicham avelim b'ikar chaylim on Shabbos. Amar Rabbi B'chana, kavei azlinam basrei der Eliezer l'shuli b'tifcha, zimne namar hamakim yifkeducha l'shalom, v'zimne namar rachmani yidkerech l'shalom. Sometimes when he would, bless us on our way leaving him, he would engage us in Lashon Kodesh, and sometimes he would engage us in Lashon Aramish. And he would say, you should have Hatzlacha, go with Hatzlacha. So the Gemara jumps in and asks right away, Hechi Avad Hachi, Ayv Amar of Yehuda, La'ilam al Yishal and Tzrachim B'Lashon Arami. A person is not supposed to do tefillas. You don't ask for Tzrachim B'Lashon Arami. Because why? Ein Malachei Asharis Nizkaken Loi. She'ein Malachei Asharis Makirim B'Lashon Arami. Because the Malachei Asharis don't understand Lashon Arami, so you can't ask tefillas in Lashon Arami. So the Gemara answers, no, Shani Chayle, the Shchinta Imei. The Chayle, the Shechina is there. When the Shechina is there itself, you could ask even in Lashon Aramis. Now Taisus points out over here, and Taisus and Brachas points it out also, that there are clearly some exceptions. There are tefillas that are made in Aramish. Taisus over here right away says Levad mi Gavriel Kadamar b'Sayt Breish Perak Elyon Amarim, that Ba Gavriel v'lim d'shivim l'shaynis l'Yosef. We know by Yosef that Gavriel taught him 70 languages, so clearly Gavriel knew Aramish also. So he says, you see, there are malachim that know more languages than other malachim. Now Yiach Shiyah, as a basic rule, this idea of not saying tefillos in Lashon Aramish is gepaskin in Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber in Siman Kuf Aleph in Sif Dalet says as follows: Yachal ispal b'chol lashon sheyir. So a person can daven in whatever language he wants. V'hani mili b'tzibur. Avol b'yachid lo yispal el b'lashon hakodesh. V'yeshayimrim v'hani mili k'shel tzrachav k'en shispal al chayla yishom tzar sheish beisay tefillah kavul tzibur. Okay, we'll talk about it in a second. So the Mechaber paskins like this Gemara, like the Stam Gemara. Now, although let's say Lamashal, the Rambam doesn't paskin like this Gemara, and the Rif does, the Rambam doesn't. So it's a mixed bag. Not all the Rishonim paskin like this Gemara on Shabbos, but the Mechaber brings this down, this Gemara, and says that you don't ask for tzrachim b'lashon Aramis. Mishnah Berurah likewise brings from the Paiskes, Paiskes Manoi, that we paskin like that, and Adrab at that time there had been a tremendous controversy that had to do with the reform, about changing tefillas from Lashon Kodesh to German, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes, it's actually like a kanoistic Mishnah Berurah, slightly out of character. I'll read you. The Mishnah Berurah says, he says, "Oid machmas kama v'kama taimim nechoichem herichu kol goyne azman b'sefer divrei bris v'eskimu she'isser gamer ulasas kain to daven in other languages lafuke mikitas chadashes shenisfartu michutz lemedina to lafuke from these outside groups that came from other areas v'hetiku es kol nusach atfil lashon ha'amim ve'avera gereres avera shediglu habrachas al kibbutz galius abirchas Yerushalayim ercha." First they chopped out some brachas ukashem sheroitzim lashgiach zichron Yerushalayim kach roitzim lashgiach lashon kodesh miYisrael. They want to avoid the chance that Klal Yisrael could be redeemed because of Leishinu as Lashainim. So they want to quickly make sure they're being Mishan everybody's Lashon. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yishmereu Midei Sapikorses Ke'elu. This is the Berel. This is Mishnah Berurah. So this is like an added character, Kanoistic in Mishnah Berurah, where he refers to, but this has had to do with the time, but this is a halacha psuka that you're now supposed to be Shayil Bakashis in Aramish. So let's talk about Kari Bain. So Kari Bain L'chari is in violation of both of these things. A, it's a bikush for tzrachim, and B, it's in Lashon Aramish. So these are two more kilonaks on singing Kari Bain on a Friday night. Now this, the Har Tzvi in a Tshuva and Arachaim addresses, and the Har Tzvi says as follows. He says, "V'chein ha'yakashali al azmir sha'imrim b'leil Shabbos b'shir shel Kari Bain shel Ribon Elam v'Olmaya." He says, "The laman is yasid b'Lashon Arami neged divrei Chazal." Why was it yasid in Lashon Arami keneged divrei Chazal that says al yishal adam tzrachav b'Lashon Arami? He says, "V'ulai mishum de berubon einei el shvachi shel makom." So this is an interesting teretz. He says Kari Bain is be'ikr shevach shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not be'ikr a tefillah. Ve'ene masket tzarchei atzmai ela b'shnei charuzim ha'achronim. Perek yasanach and l'mikdash echtovah l'kodesh kodshin. Then he throws in, and this is an important line, he says, "V'ulai zeh einei nechshav tzrachav kishu mispal al binyan beis hamikdash v'al gulas Yisrael." That might not be called your tzrachim when you're davening for gulas Yisrael and for binyan beis hamikdash. That's, cosmic tzrachim. That's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's tzrachim. That's everybody's tzrachim. That's not tzrachim. We mentioned this teretz last week a little bit, that something that isn't personal and is not going to inspire some sort of great angst, is allowed. Now, so this is our Tzvi's teretz, that even though Kari Bain is in violation, of both of these rules, of Bikush Tzrachim and of Baramish, he says these are not tefillas in that manner. These are, Bikush Tzrachim in the larger sense. These are like, I said the story over recently somewhere else, but there was a story just popping into my mind now. There was a story with a Cantonist who had lost all his shaykhs to religion, like many of these stories, and he came to shul on a Erev Yom Kippur, and he didn't have anything to daven to sit there. Someone tried to bring him a siddur, show him what to say, and he waved it off. He doesn't need this. And finally, he lets out a krechts, and he says, "I should daven for Parnasa. I have a pension from Tsar Nikolai. I should daven for kinder. I don't have children. They took that away from me when they put me in the army for 30 years. I should daven for Arichas Yamim. What's my Arichas Yamim worth? I don't need Arichas Yamim. My life, I'm gespielt. I'm done. Whenever the time is the time." He says, "Nevas, the only thing I could daven for is Yiskadav Yiskadav Shmei Rabbi. Just davening that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name should be revealed." So, Kilu, the Har Tzvi is saying the same idea. Tefillah that's the Mikdash Yichtov, Perek Yasanach, which is a Tefillah for Gila Ashchina. A Tefillah for Gila Ashchina is not bound by the regular rules of Bakashis, of Aramish. It's like Shechina Shruya, meaning Hagam, the Sefer Chaim Yam is describing the hordes of Malachim that gathered to hear the Zmira, but the Zmira of Kari Bain in this format of a Tefillah is much more general, in its way. Now, there's a few more. Okay, I'm going to have to rush this through. I just want to get to that point. There's a few more just short tainis that are relevant in singing Kari Bain, and that is that they don't have so much to do with Kari Bain. They have more to do with Yisrael Najara. The Sefer Shtei Yadis from Rabbi Menachem di Lunzano, who was another Makubal from the Gurei Ari who lived in Tzfas. He has a few starke tainis on Rishon LaJara's songs. One of them is actually a very relevant shaila that's discussed extensively in the Paiskim, is about singing songs that are secular tunes. It seems that a lot of Rishon LaJara's songs in Zemiris Yisrael were set to secular music, to the music of the day, to Arabic music or to whatever. Now, this is another big shaila, for Chazanim in general. Could you? Yeah, you can hear. No, well, we don't know if Ribon was set to that. Other songs in Yisrael, he doesn't refer to this. I said this is not a Ribon problem. This is a Rishon LaJara problem. That Menachem Lunzano makes a big spiel about. Now, I wanted to get to it, but I think I'll save it for next week because it's a Grace Shmuz. There's a Shuv from the Rif. There's a Bach. There's a Magen Avram. There's a Ramah. There's the Mekubalim have to say about it. Moshe is a famous Shuv everybody knows about songs, with sketchy origin. And the third critique the second critique that Menachem Lunzano has, and this is again not about Ribon specifically, but it is about Rishon LaJara's Negunim, was that they refer to Hashem in a very personal, familial way. I could show you maybe next week when I continue. I'll talk about the songs specifically talking about. It's very familial. Now that many songs are like that, and still today, meaning these two tainis that Menachem Lunzano has are current events. Meaning there's a dime a dozen of songs that the first time you hear them, they rub you the wrong way. That's a little bit too direct. That's so. Yeah. This is the same school, same time. And so I'm going to save those two tainis. We'll go into them next week. Just the third one, and this is a throwaway shaila, an interesting. It's a funny machshava. Is the Mishnah in Megillah and Bracha says ha'imr meidim mishaskin. I say someone says meidim we don't let him do it because it's mechzik like this shtei reshuyis. So it looks like he's saying too. Now when the Olam sings Ribon but other songs, a lot of the tunes are very repetitive. It's alekadilei. So you could say alekadilei 20 times or 10 times. What do you say? Yeah, it's repetition, so it sounds like Shtei Reshuyos. Meaning, is there a problem of saying something else that isn't a tefillah, in a way that's repetitious, where specifically, let's say like a Likadilei, where you're calling out HaKadosh Baruch Hu and you're saying it repetitiously again and again and again, is there an issue? And most places seem to say, and this is based on a Ramah and a Magen Avram, that only the Ikrei tefillas that are, meyusid for like Kabbalah Samach Shemayim. I saw someone ask Chaim Kanievsky if when you're being Mavas Sedra in the parashas that have Shema Yisrael, could you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad 2 times in a row? Or is that Mechzik Shtei Reshuyos? They have to split it up. And Chaim said that it's it's not a concern. But it's the same type of shaila. I noticed someone asking it. I think it's a humorous shaila, so I want to share. But I guess we'll come back to Menachem Lunzano and Rishon LaJara's Mevucha about songs next week in Mitzvah Shem. Yeah, the Shal Shabbos one.
No, the Friday night. It's first of all the Una Ramashke. I don't know, but
right.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.